Hurricane season begins in just days. But the bigger question this year may not be how many storms form. It may be whether FEMA is ready when one does.
Welcome to Meteorology Matters, the podcast that dives deep into the science, chaos, and stories behind the weather that shapes our world.
This show was created by meteorologist Rob Jones.
We're looking at a deeply concerning convergence of factors this year. The meteorological data presents one reality, but the human infrastructure we rely on when that data translates into a physical event, well, it's facing an unprecedented internal crisis.
And that brings us directly to our central question, the thread we are going to follow for the entirety of this deep dive.
Right.
If a major disaster happens tomorrow, what does FEMA's current situation mean for response and recovery?
It's the only question that matters right now.
But before we look at the systemic breakdown, we do need to establish the baseline of what we are facing in the atmosphere. The NOAA, that is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, often referred to as NOAA, they've released their official outlook.
Yeah, and the forecast actually leans quieter than average. They're citing a 55% chance of a below-normal season.
Which is largely due to a developing El Niño climate pattern.
Yeah.
Just to be precise for you on the terminology, that is El Niño, pronounced El Niño. The Nin sounds like the Ninian Canyon.
Sure, and the presence of that pattern shifts upper-level wind currents. And I do mean winds with a short eye, like weather, not winding a clock.
Right, and those currents tend to suppress Atlantic hurricane formation. But the critical caveat in the NOAA report is that 1 to 3 storms could still potentially become major hurricanes.
And that is why we cannot afford to be complacent just because of a quieter forecast. Any season can produce a major disaster.
It only takes one.
Yeah, the broader atmospheric setup might inhibit sheer numbers, but it just takes one storm entering the Gulf of Mexico or tracking up the Atlantic seaboard to cause catastrophic loss of life and property.
And we should clarify, we always say the Gulf of Mexico, never the Gulf of America.
Right, but the meteorological conditions are simply the trigger. The far more pressing issue right now is the response framework.
Because a quiet forecast is a stroke of luck.
And luck isn't a strategy. We have to look at the current state of the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
So let's follow that thread from the forecast directly into the administrator's office. Because the situation inside FEMA right now, it's experiencing a level of leadership whiplash that is really difficult to comprehend.
It really is. I mean, institutional stability in any massive federal bureaucracy flows from the top down.
For context, if we look back at the previous director, Dean Criswell, she served for 4 consecutive years. She provided a steady hand.
Yeah, and contrast that with the past 16 months, FEMA has seen 5 different acting directors in that short time frame.
5 acting directors in 16 months.
When you have a revolving door in the administrator's office like that, strategic planning doesn't just suffer, it essentially ceases to exist.
The agency just shifts into a permanent state of triage.
Yeah, and the timeline of this turnover reveals a lot about the incredible pressures the agency is operating under right now.
Let's trace that timeline because it's wild. Starting in January 2025, Cameron Hamilton was initially appointed as acting director.
Right.
And within 2 months, the Department of Homeland Security, which houses FEMA, did something that sounds like it belongs in a political thriller. They subjected Hamilton to a polygraph test.
A lie detector test.
Yeah.
For an acting agency director.
They were trying to determine if he was the source of a leak regarding a private White House meeting. And that meeting was discussing the potential elimination of FEMA altogether.
Which is an astonishing thing to even be discussing, let alone polygraphing your leadership over. Then the situation escalated publicly.
This was in May 2025, right?
Yeah, Hamilton testified before a House Appropriations subcommittee. He was asked directly about these elimination discussions.
And during that hearing, he stated unequivocally, on the record, that he did not believe eliminating FEMA was in the best interest of the American public.
And he was fired the very next day.
Abruptly dismissed.
Yeah, and that dismissal removed whatever remaining stability the agency had. It set off a chain reaction of temporary appointments.
So David Richardson was brought in to succeed Hamilton on May 8th.
But Richardson's tenure only lasted roughly 6 months.
Because of the floods, right?
Yeah, he submitted his resignation in November. There was widespread, really intense criticism of a botched federal response to devastating floods in Texas.
So Richardson is out. And after him, Karen Evans took over in December.
And she held the acting administrator role for just over 5 months.
Before being quietly removed?
Yeah, removed and replaced by Robert Fenton, who's currently the acting chief as we record this.
And then there's a twist that is genuinely hard to process. Cameron Hamilton, the guy who was fired after the polygraph and the congressional testimony, he has now been renominated to take over the agency once again.
You really can't make it up.
I have to stop and ask, how does an agency of this scale function with that kind of erratic command structure? I mean, it feels like a major hospital abruptly firing its experienced ER doctors to cut administrative costs,
Sure.
letting the hospital fall into total chaos, and then frantically trying to rehire those exact same doctors in the ambulance bay just as a multi-car pileup occurs on the highway outside.
That ER analogy is actually highly accurate, particularly regarding the concept of triage and specialization.
How so?
Well, the issue at the core of this turnover is the destruction of institutional knowledge. Managing a national disaster response isn't just about moving pallets of water and deploying rescue teams.
It's much more bureaucratic than that.
Extremely. It involves navigating incredibly complex, rigid regulatory frameworks. It requires established relationships and coordination with state governors, local emergency managers, and tribal leaders.
You're managing multi-billion-dollar federal supply chains in real time.
Under extreme duress. And when experienced disaster managers leave, the operational muscle memory of the agency goes with them.
So the states are the ones who really feel that loss.
Right, because state and local emergency managers rely on established continuity. They need to know exactly how and when federal support will arrive so they can plan their own local responses.
And when that continuity at the federal level is severed by 5 directors in 16 months,
Local governments are essentially left operating in the dark. Every time a new acting director steps in, they have to navigate a massive learning curve.
they have to assess the immediate threats and try to implement their own operational directives.
Yeah, but before those new directives can even filter down to the regional offices, the leadership changes again.
But the chaos in the administrator's office is really only the most visible part of the disruption. We have to look at the staffing and morale collapse across the entire agency.
From the top executives all the way down to the field workers.
Right, because since January 2025, FEMA has lost more than 5,000 employees.
And nearly half of the agency's top 38 leadership positions are currently vacant.
A massive driver of that workforce exodus was something called the Deferred Resignation Program, or the DRP.
Yeah, this program allowed federal employees to essentially take administrative leave or accept buyouts.
And within FEMA, it triggered just a devastating brain drain. We saw senior management, experienced field coordinators, and long-term institutional leaders walking out the door.
And the driving factor for many of these departures wasn't just a normal retirement. It was this overarching, pervasive fear that the agency was on the verge of being dismantled or abolished entirely.
You hear the number 5,000 employees lost. And to understand the impact of that, you really need to break down the math on FEMA's workforce.
Because the numbers presented to the public can be highly deceiving.
Yeah, you will often hear politicians or press releases state that FEMA has 20,000 employees. And that sounds like a robust, massive standing army ready to deploy.
But when you look closer at the actual structure, only about 5,000 of those are permanent, full-time staff working day in and day out.
So 5,000 permanent staff, and they just lost 5,000 employees across the board. The math is grim.
It is. The remaining 15,000 of that 20,000 number are divided between reservists and core employees.
And reservists operate on a strict part-time basis, right?
Yeah, they have other jobs and lives. They are only activated and deployed when a disaster actually occurs.
But the core employees are different. That stands for cadre of on-call response and recovery employees.
They are a different category entirely. They typically serve in 2 to 4 year contracts.
They're really the operational backbone in the field.
Yeah, they are often the first federal response on the ground, coordinating with local officials. And crucially, they stay with affected communities for years during the long, grinding rebuilding phase.
And recently, there was a mass non-renewal of these vital core contracts.
The Department of Homeland Security had ordered FEMA to develop operational plans for a 50% workforce cut.
50%. While that broader sweeping cut was reportedly paused, the agency still moved forward with shedding around 200 core workers late last year.
By simply choosing not to renew their contracts.
But those dismissals did not go unnoticed. The American Federation of Government Employees, which is the union representing these workers, brought a forceful lawsuit against the agency.
They argued that the non-renewals were not just ill-advised, but actually illegal.
Because it would leave FEMA fundamentally incapable of fulfilling its statutory mission to respond to domestic disasters.
Right. And under the mounting pressure of that lawsuit, and with the reality of hurricane season looming, the new DHS Secretary, Mark Wayne Mullen, reversed the policy.
So FEMA is now in the process of frantically trying to bring back those 200 core employees.
But you can't just flip a switch and expect them to return.
No, many of them have likely already moved on to other employment in the private sector or local government.
The rehiring process is a purely reactive measure. It's an attempt to stabilize a critical deployment force at the 11th hour.
But bringing back a fraction of the workforce doesn't address the deeper cultural issues.
No, the ethical and morale issues that have taken root within the agency over the last year are severe.
Which brings us to one of the most profound documents to emerge from this crisis, the Katrina Declaration.
Yeah, last August, coinciding with the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, a group of FEMA employees released an open petition to Congress.
And we really need to spend some time on this because it speaks to the very soul of what FEMA is supposed to be.
The 20th anniversary of Katrina is a heavy milestone for emergency management.
The catastrophic failures of the federal response in New Orleans in 2005 led to the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act of 2006.
And those reforms explicitly reorganized FEMA to ensure that the systemic abandonment of vulnerable populations would never happen again.
Specifically, Black and low-income individuals who lacked the resources to evacuate or rebuild.
Right. And the employees who signed this Katrina Declaration warned that FEMA was drifting dangerously far from those exact reforms.
They stated that the internal chaos, the funding freezes, and the shifting policies were actively dismantling safeguards designed to protect the people who rely on federal assistance the most.
And the response to that petition from former DHS Secretary Kristi Noem's office was immediate, and it was punitive.
The 14 workers who signed the declaration, these are people who are risking their careers to raise an ethical alarm about the agency's trajectory. They were suspended.
Placed on paid administrative leave for 8 months, completely removed from their duties.
Now, Secretary Mullen recently reinstated those 14 workers as well.
But the damage to the agency's culture is palpable.
One of the emergency management specialists who signed it, Abby McElraith, noted upon returning from her suspension that FEMA is arguably in a worse state now than it was when they issued the warning a year ago.
Yeah. A widespread hiring freeze remains in effect. Critical funding pipelines for local projects are stalled, and the agency still lacks a legally confirmed permanent administrator.
Following the thread from this internal collapse, we arrive back at our central question.
If a major disaster happens tomorrow, what does FEMA's current situation mean for response and recovery?
To answer that practically, we have to look at the sheer volume of the workload currently sitting on the agency's desk.
They are not waiting for a disaster to happen. They are already buried underneath them.
The caseload is staggering. FEMA is currently managing a massive backlog of over 300,000 individual projects.
Spread across more than 600 open disaster declarations.
And we have to be clear about what a project means. These aren't just files sitting in a cabinet in Washington.
No, a project is a washed-out state highway. It's a flooded middle school. It's a destroyed municipal water treatment plant.
These numbers represent thousands of communities actively waiting for federal financial support so they can rebuild their basic infrastructure.
And adding an incredible amount of friction to that logistical strain is the severe financial hurdle the agency only recently cleared.
FEMA is coming off a massive 100-plus day shutdown of the Department of Homeland Security.
Right, which included an initial 76-day funding lapse, followed closely by another 40-day lapse.
That shutdown severely depleted FEMA's Disaster Relief Fund, which is the primary checking account the federal government uses to pay for disaster recovery.
And because the fund was drained, it forced the agency to operate under what's known as a restricted spending model.
It wasn't until late April 2026 that Congress finally passed the DHS Appropriations Act, replenishing the fund with $26.4 billion.
But during that restricted period, bureaucratic bottlenecks were artificially tightened. The agency was essentially ordered to preserve cash.
And this is where it gets crazy. Former Secretary Noem instituted a policy requiring her personal, cabinet-level approval for any agency expenditure over $100,000.
Yeah.
Wait, let me stop you right there. A cabinet secretary had to personally sign off on any expense over $100,000.
Yes. For a nationwide disaster response agency.
I mean, in a major disaster zone, $100,000 might not even cover the cost of a few heavy-duty generators and a week's supply of bottled water for a single neighborhood.
It doesn't.
If you are managing 300,000 projects, how does anything get done with a bottleneck like that?
It doesn't. That is the whole point. Requiring cabinet-level approval for a threshold that low in the context of multi-billion-dollar recovery efforts severely delayed critical funds from reaching the ground.
It paralyzed the regional directors.
Yeah, directors who normally have the authority to quickly disperse funds to state contractors couldn't move. Secretary Mullen has since revoked that specific requirement, returning some autonomy to the agency.
But the massive backlog of unpaid invoices and delayed projects it created remains.
Right. And to understand why a functioning FEMA is so critical, why these bottlenecks cost lives and destroy local economies, we only have to look back at the stress test of 2025.
The realities of last year's disasters really paint a grim picture of what is required from the federal government.
In January 2025, California experienced the catastrophic Eaton and Palisades wildfires. Those fires moved with unprecedented speed, resulting in 440 lives lost.
And then in July, severe, slow-moving floods in Kerr County, Texas, claimed 119 lives.
And the failure to coordinate resources effectively during that event is what directly led to Acting Director David Richardson's resignation.
Then, Hurricanes Helene and Milton struck the Gulf of Mexico coast, taking 232 and 15 lives, respectively, and devastating coastal infrastructure.
The financial toll of those events was equally historic.
The first half of 2025 alone saw a record-breaking $101 billion in weather and climate disaster damage across the United States.
$101 billion in just 6 months.
I want to clarify something for you regarding FEMA's exact role in situations with that scale of destruction. Because when you see news footage of a disaster, you often picture federal workers in windbreakers handing out water or FEMA helicopters pulling people off roofs.
Sure, that's the iconic image.
Right. Is that their primary function, or are they essentially just the checkbook for the recovery?
It's a combination of both, but the financial aspect is by far the most paramount. Well, FEMA does have on-the-ground surge forces, those core employees and reservists we discussed earlier. Their job in the immediate aftermath is to coordinate logistics, establish incident command structures, and integrate federal resources with local first responders.
They provide the initial connective tissue.
Exactly. However, FEMA's most critical long-term function is acting as the logistical and financial backbone for state and local governments over the years of recovery.
So a hobbled, underfunded FEMA doesn't just mean you see fewer federal jackets at a disaster site.
It means local mayors and state governors lack the capital to clear millions of tons of debris. They can't rebuild critical bridges or provide temporary sheltering for thousands of displaced citizens.
Without that federal checkbook, local recovery simply grinds to a halt.
And that distinction, understanding that FEMA is the financial engine of recovery, is crucial as we shift to the current, highly debated proposals aiming to drastically reduce the agency's role.
Right, because President Trump commissioned a FEMA review council to evaluate the agency from top to bottom and identify structural reforms.
And they recently released their final report, which contains 150 sweeping recommendations.
The central organizing theme running through those 150 recommendations is a concept called devolution.
The council is proposing a fundamental transformation of American disaster response.
What does devolution actually mean in this context?
It means pushing operational and, more importantly, financial responsibility heavily onto state, local, tribal, and territorial governments.
Often referred to in policy circles as SLTT entities.
Right. Under this proposed model, FEMA would step back into a secondary supporting role. They'd reserve federal financial assistance only for what the report calls truly significant events.
Let's break down the real-world economics of devolution, because a major part of this strategy involves shifting financial thresholds. The report recommends significantly raising the public assistance program's damage per capita indicator.
Which sounds like deep bureaucratic jargon, but it's incredibly important.
Think of the per capita indicator as an insurance deductible for an entire state. Right now, a state might have to prove, say, $10 million in uninsured public infrastructure damage before FEMA opens its wallet to help.
But the new proposal wants to crank that deductible so incredibly high that unless a storm essentially wipes a major city off the map, the state has to pay for the cleanup entirely out of its own pocket.
To put the scale of that shift into perspective, an analysis by the Urban Institute looked at this exact proposal.
Yeah, they applied those proposed threshold changes retrospectively to all federal disasters between 2008 and 2024.
And they found that if these higher deductibles had been in place, it would have shifted approximately $41 billion in recovery costs directly onto state and local governments.
$41 billion, and we need to understand the fundamental difference between federal and state funding here.
The federal government can engage in deficit spending to fund a $20 billion disaster recovery bill.
Right, but state governments, by and large, are legally bound by their state constitutions to balance their budgets every single year.
So if a state is suddenly hit with a $5 billion hurricane cleanup bill and FEMA isn't paying, the state cannot just print money.
They have to find that $5 billion immediately.
That means slashing funding for public education, reducing police and fire department budgets, or severely cutting state healthcare programs to pay for the disaster.
The Council's report also tackles the National Flood Insurance Program, the NFIP, which is currently administered by FEMA.
And that program is burdened with more than $20 billion in debt. It relies on what the Council describes as heavily subsidized, outdated risk assessments.
So the proposal is to privatize the flood insurance program entirely.
Furthermore, the report suggests strictly capping federal disaster payouts for individual homeowners and renters, severely limiting how much aid a family can receive to rebuild their home.
But there is also a legislative alternative brewing parallel to the Council's report. It's driven by lawmakers who see the current system failing but fundamentally disagree with devolution.
In Congress, the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee recently advanced a bipartisan bill called H.R. 4669, known as the FEMA Act.
And the approach of the FEMA Act is structurally very different.
Instead of just devolving responsibilities to the states, it proposes splitting FEMA away from the Department of Homeland Security entirely.
Establishing it as an independent cabinet-level agency.
The core argument there is that subsuming FEMA into the massive DHS bureaucracy after 9/11 is what caused the dysfunction in the first place.
They argue that removing FEMA from that bureaucracy would streamline its operations, restore its direct line to the president, and eliminate the kind of departmental bottlenecks like the $100,000 approval rule that we saw over the last year.
So both the Executive Council's recommendations and the congressional bill agree on one fundamental truth. The current system is flawed and unsustainable.
But they diverge sharply on the solution. One seeks to shrink the federal role, the other seeks to elevate and untangle it.
But looking closely at the devolution strategy, there seems to be a glaring inherent inequality. If the federal safety net shrinks and states are forced to pay for their own disaster recovery out of their own balanced budgets, won't this create a stark geographical divide in this country?
It absolutely will.
Wealthy states with high property values and massive tax bases might be able to absorb the blow, recover, and rebuild quickly. But poorer states with lower fiscal capacity, states that already struggle to fund basic services, they could be left permanently devastated by a single hurricane.
It echoes the exact ethical concerns raised by the workers in the Katrina Declaration.
Right.
That inequality is the absolute crux of the debate, and there are two distinct perspectives driving this policy clash.
Proponents of devolution argue that the current federal system is a bloated, inefficient bureaucracy that actually creates a moral hazard.
They believe that heavily subsidizing disaster recovery at the federal level discourages local governments from investing in their own preparedness, enforcing strict building codes, or building resilient infrastructure.
They argue that if states have skin in the game financially, they will build smarter.
But on the other side, emergency managers, urban planners, and policy critics warn that shifting these massive costs before states have the actual fiscal capacity to handle them will inevitably leave vulnerable populations stranded.
Because lower income and minority communities rely disproportionately on federal assistance to recover, since they lack robust private insurance.
Yeah, and if you remove the pillar of federal assistance without a viable funded replacement at the state level, the localized economic collapse after a major storm could be irreversible for decades.
Which brings this macro-level policy debate directly down to you. We return to our central question.
If a hurricane strikes next week, what does this internal chaos, this loss of staff, and this push for devolution mean for you?
The administration has explicitly stated its intent to begin weaning states off FEMA assistance following the 2026 hurricane season.
Which means the timeline for this monumental transition in how America handles disasters is incredibly compressed. It is happening right now.
And we're not just talking about post-disaster cleanup either. We are also talking about the loss of critical pre-disaster hazard mitigation funding.
Yeah, these are the grants that pay for upgrading aging stormwater drainage systems in local neighborhoods, elevating roads, or reinforcing seawalls to prevent flooding in the first place.
If your town's drainage system floods your street every spring and those upgrade projects are no longer federally funded, Local city councils are going to be forced into a corner.
They either have to dramatically raise your local property taxes to pay for the upgrades themselves, or they simply skip the infrastructure improvements and force you to accept the flooding risk.
And we are already seeing the fallout from this financial uncertainty at the local level.
Hmm.
Some local municipal governments, particularly in high-risk coastal areas like South Florida, are actively exploring the creation of their own local, taxpayer-funded disaster reserves.
They are doing this because they look at the 5,000 vacant positions at FEMA, they look at the devolution reports, and they no longer have confidence that federal funds will arrive in time or at all following a major event.
So, with FEMA openly described in federal reports as having an irreparably damaged brand and facing a clear mandate for a reduced operational footprint, how should you alter your personal disaster prep?
Because the old paradigm is simple. You board up your windows, you survive the storm, and then you apply for FEMA aid to help replace your roof or your ruined belongings while the federal government rebuilds your town.
But the era of assuming the federal government is coming to make you whole after a storm is rapidly ending?
The responsibility is being localized. Every listener living in a vulnerable area must audit their personal readiness right now without the assumption of a federal safety net.
What does that personal audit actually look like in practice?
First and foremost, you must verify your own private insurance coverage. If the National Flood Insurance Program is privatized or overhauled to reflect true market risk, premiums and availability could shift drastically.
You need to know exactly what your policy covers, what your deductibles are, and what is explicitly excluded.
Second, securing personal emergency funds is more critical than it has ever been.
Because you cannot rely on federal payouts, which may be severely capped or entirely eliminated under the new devolution proposals, to rebuild your life, replace your vehicle, or cover months of temporary housing.
The financial burden of natural disasters is being pushed down the chain. It is being placed directly on the shoulders of the local municipality and ultimately the individual homeowner.
It ties this whole investigation together. The quieter NOAA forecast for this season is a stroke of meteorological luck. But the structural integrity of the nation's disaster response system is deeply fractured.
If a storm does track into the Gulf of Mexico and make landfall, the safety net that communities have relied on for decades may simply not be there to catch them.
This internal crisis at FEMA forces us to look beyond the immediate weather forecast.
If the federal government steps back from disaster recovery, making natural disasters a purely local economic problem, how will that reshape where Americans choose to live and buy homes in the future?
It is a massive question, and one we will be watching closely as this season unfolds. If you want to follow more of this reporting and keep up with how these policies evolve, make sure you connect with Rob Jones on social media. You can find him on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, and Bluesky.
And if you found today's deep dive valuable, please take a moment to like, follow, comment, and rate the show on whatever platform you're using. It really helps the show reach more people.
You've been listening to Meteorology Matters, created by meteorologist Rob Jones. Thanks for listening, and remember, meteorology always matters.